The cowboy who married the woman the territory threw away. The fence post went in crooked, and I knew it before I tamped the second shovelful of dirt. Could feel it in my wrist, the way the post shifted just a hair left when I let go, like it was thinking about it. I pulled it, dug another 6 inches, reset it. Third time it stood right. Nobody saw that. Nobody was going to see it. The north pasture fence ran half a mile of nothing in every direction, and the nearest neighbor was Caleb Prout, who I hadn't spoken to in 2 years on account of his dog getting into my chickens and him not apologizing for it. So I was out there alone, October sun pressing down on the back of my neck, and I pulled that post 3 times until it stood the way it was supposed to stand, and then I moved on to the next one. That's the part nobody tells you about living alone. The standards don't slip, maybe they go up, because there's no one to blame it on and there's no one to tell you it's good enough, and after a while you stop needing anyone to tell you. The fence is right or it isn't. The calf gets pulled when it needs pulling or it doesn't make it. The winter wheat goes in at the right depth or you're buying flour in February. It's just you and the land and whether you did it right. I'd been doing it right, or trying to, for going on 22 years on that place. Bought it when I was 31 with money I'd saved working cattle drives out of Texas, plus what my father left me, which wasn't much but it was something. 160 acres on the Cimarron River bottom, good grass, a spring that ran even in dry summers, timber for building and fence posts. I put up a house by myself, 2 rooms, then a third when I thought I might have need of it. Built a barn, a proper one, with a hay loft and room for 6 horses. Dug a second well when the first one showed signs of going mineral. Planted an orchard, apple, pear, 2 plum trees that took 6 years to produce anything worth eating, which is the kind of patience a man develops on his own or doesn't develop at all. In those 22 years, I had put in miles of fence. I had cleared brush from the river bottom twice, once in the bad drought of '71, and once when beavers moved in and backed the water up into my lower pasture. I had rebuilt the chimney after it cracked in the freeze of '78, working from a scaffold in January, my hands going numb every hour and me coming down to warm them by the cook fire and going back up. I had buried 3 horses and a cow and a dog named Waller who had been with me for 11 years, and who I still thought about sometimes when the evenings got long. I was, by the count of that October morning, 53 years old. I had run this place by myself for all of it, and I had run it right. And if you'd asked me whether I was satisfied with my life, I would have said yes. And I would have been lying, but it would have been the kind of lie you tell yourself so many times it starts to feel like the truth. The kind of lie you stop being able to see because it's in everything, the way dust gets into everything out here, and you stop seeing the dust. I was alone, not because I'd chosen it, not precisely. I had wanted a wife when I was young, wanted it the way men do when they're young and the wanting doesn't have any practical weight to it yet, when it's just a feeling that there should be something more in the evenings. I'd asked Dora Fielding in my 2nd year on the place. She was the schoolteacher's daughter, steady and serious, good hands, and she'd said she'd think on it. And then she married a dry goods merchant from Dodge City without telling me she'd made up her mind. I found out from the postmaster who sold me my stamps and mentioned it like he thought I already knew. After that I did what men do when the thing they wanted doesn't come. I worked. Not to forget it. You don't forget things like that. You just stop carrying them at the front of your mind. But because the work was real and the land was real, and those were things I could get right. You find out who you are when you work hard enough and long enough with nobody watching. You find out what matters to you and what doesn't. What you'll hold to and what you'll let go. By the time I was 53, which is when this story really starts, I had been alone so long that most people in the county had stopped thinking of me as a man who might be otherwise. I was just Cole Alderman, the man on the Cimarron place. Capable, quiet, a fair hand at a branding, honest at cards, reliable when a neighbor needed help and not much for small talk. A man who kept to himself and kept his land right, and had never given anyone cause for complaint, and never given anyone a real reason to pay him much attention. That was the accounting, and it was accurate as far as it went. Then Margaret Sloane came into my life, and she didn't come in easy. It was the third week of October when I drove the wagon into Sentinel to pick up a load of lumber I'd ordered from the mill. Planks for a new floor in the barn. The old ones had gone soft in spots, punky at the edges, and I'd put it off 2 years already because lumber wasn't cheap and I kept thinking maybe another season. But I'd put my boot through one plank in August and decided another season was one too many. I pulled up to the mill at around 9 in the morning, and the loading took the better part of an hour, me and the mill hand stacking and roping the load while the mill hand's apprentice, a boy of about 14, held the horse's head and tried to look useful. It was good lumber, straight-grained, dried right. I checked every plank before it went on the wagon. Some men would say that's too particular for barn flooring. Those men have soft barn floors. By the time I was done, I was thirsty, and the horse needed water. So I drove over to the trough beside the livery and let her drink while I stretched my back and watched the street. That's when I noticed the woman sitting on the steps of the old Ritter building. The Ritter building had been a hardware store once. Harold Ritter had run it for 20 years, and then Harold Ritter had died, and his son had sold the inventory and locked the doors and moved to Colorado. And now the building sat empty with its windows boarded, and the sign faded to the point where you couldn't read what it had said. A building that had stopped being anything, waiting for someone to decide what it would be next. That's a particular kind of waiting. She was sitting on the bottom step with a carpetbag beside her, and a child asleep across her lap. A girl, maybe 4 or 5, hair tangled. Her small shoes too small in the way children's shoes get when the child has grown faster than the household could keep pace with. The woman herself was maybe 30, dark-haired, wearing a dress that had been good once and wasn't now, the kind of dress that's been mended in 3 or 4 places by someone who sewed well enough to make the mending last but not well enough to make you forget it was mending. She wasn't crying. She wasn't looking at the street with any particular expression. She was just sitting there in that particular way a person sits when they have nowhere to go, and they know it, and they've already made their peace with it for right now, and they'll make their peace with it again in an hour. I watered the horse. I didn't look at the woman again. I had lumber to get home and a barn floor to pull up before the ground froze. I got about 20 feet down the street before I stopped the wagon. I sat there a minute. The horse switched her tail. Down the street, a dog barked at something and then stopped. I thought about the drive home and the unloading and the floor. Then I turned the wagon around. I don't know exactly what I was thinking. Maybe I wasn't thinking. Maybe it was just the same thing that makes you pull a fence post 3 times until it stands right even when nobody's watching. Some accounting you keep with yourself that doesn't have any words to it. It's just there, and you either meet it or you don't. I pulled the wagon up to the Ritter building and I didn't say anything clever when I stopped. I just said, "You need a meal." She looked up at me, not frightened. I'll give her that right now. She had a way of looking at a person that was measuring but not hostile, the kind of look a woman develops when she's had to get good at reading people fast and getting it right. She looked at me for maybe 4 seconds and then she said, "We had breakfast." I said that wasn't what I asked. She held my eyes another moment. The child stirred in her lap and settled. Then she said yes. Her name was Margaret. The girl was her daughter, Lucy. We went to the hotel dining room, which was the only place in Sentinel that served a proper midday meal, and I ordered them both without asking roast beef, potatoes, bread, and butter, because I'd looked at them for about 30 seconds and knew what they needed, and I had coffee and let them eat without talking much, because that was the right thing to do. Lucy woke up somewhere in the middle of it. She woke up the way children do when they're very hungry, which is to say without protest or confusion, just open eyes and then a fork in her hand. She ate methodical and serious, cleaning her plate with a focus that told me this was a child who'd been hungry enough times to take eating seriously and not waste any of it. She drank 2 glasses of milk. I ordered her a third without being asked because it seemed like the thing to do. When they were done and I'd paid, and Lucy was looking at the last piece of bread on the board and deciding whether it was polite to want it. Margaret said, "You want to know?" I said, "Only what you want to tell." She told me anyway. Her husband had been a man named Frank Sloan, a farmer outside of Liberal, over in southwest Kansas. They'd been married 7 years. In August, he'd gotten sick, fever first, then a lung sickness that the doctor in Liberal called pneumonia and said he'd seen it worse, and he was dead in 3 weeks, 23 days from the first cough to the grave. She said it the way people say things they've had to say enough times that the saying of it has separated from the feeling of it, like a scab that's healed over. He had debts she hadn't known about. Not a little in debt, badly in debt to the bank and to 2 merchants, and to his brother in Kansas City in amounts that left nothing when it was all tallied. The farm went to the bank in September. His brother came down from Kansas City and took the mule team and the milk cow and most of the furniture, said it covered a loan Frank had taken out 3 years before and never mentioned to Margaret. She'd stood in the yard and watched him load her kitchen table onto a wagon, and she'd said nothing because there was nothing to say. It was either right or it wasn't, and she had no way to prove it wasn't. Margaret and Lucy were left with the carpet bag, $40 she'd kept separate in a coffee tin for 3 years out of some instinct she couldn't name at the time and now was grateful for, and 2 weeks of a neighbor's charity. She'd come to Sentinel because a woman in Liberal had told her there was work here, housekeeping at the hotel. But the hotel had hired a girl from a local family the week before Margaret arrived. She'd been in Sentinel 5 days. The $40 was down to 11. She'd asked about laundry work, cooking work, cleaning work, anything. Most people had said they'd think on it. She said, "Nobody's thinking on it." Not bitter. Just accurate the way a person is accurate when they don't have the energy left to be anything else. I turned my coffee cup in my hands. I thought about things. I thought about the 3rd room I'd built in my house 20 years ago thinking I might have need of it, and the bed I'd built for it out of walnut I'd cut on the place, headboard and all, a good bed, and the way the room had stood empty for 20 years. I thought about the winter coming. I knew what winter looked like on the Cimarron by October, could feel it in the air when the wind shifted north, and it was going to be a hard one. I thought about what $11 looked like spread across the weeks between October and spring. I said, "I have a place out on the Cimarron River, 160 acres, house, barn, orchard. I live there alone. I'm not asking you anything improper, I want to say that plain. But I have a room that's been empty a long time and I could use a cook and someone to keep the house through the winter. Pay wouldn't be much to start, but it'd be steady, and you and the girl would have a roof and meals and a warm fire every night. You can leave any time you want to. I wouldn't hold you to anything." She looked at me, that measuring look again. I said, "I know you don't know me. That's a fair concern." She said, "What's your name?" "Cole Alderman." "How long you had the place?" 22 years come spring." Something moved in her face. Not quite a smile. Something more like a mental filing, the way a careful person files a piece of information before they make a decision. She looked at Lucy, who had finally taken the last piece of bread and was eating it with the same focused seriousness she'd given everything else. Then she looked back at me. She said, "All right, Mr. Alderman." They rode home in the wagon on top of the lumber, Margaret sitting on the seat beside me and Lucy burrowed between us out of the wind with a horse blanket I kept under the seat for no particular purpose until now. It was cold by afternoon, clouds coming in from the northwest the way they do in October when they mean business, and I pushed the mare a little harder than usual to make the river crossing before dark. Margaret didn't say much on the drive. She watched the country go by the way you watch country when you're thinking about whether you've made the right decision and you're trying to read the land for information. The flat grass east of town gave way to the cottonwoods along the river, the limestone bluffs that caught the late light and held it orange, the tangles of plum and wild grape in the draws. Once she said, "It's pretty country." I said, "It'll do." She almost smiled at that. I saw the edge of it. I showed her the house when we got there, just the 2 rooms I'd used and the third room, the one with the walnut bed. It was a plain room, but it was a good one. The bed was solid. There was a chest for clothes. The window faced east so it would have morning light. I'd swept it out a week before on some instinct I hadn't examined closely at the time. I said, "It's yours and the girls'. There's a bar on the inside of the door." I said that last part carefully because it needed saying. She looked at the bar, then she looked at me. Then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Alderman." I went back to the kitchen to start the stove and gave them time to settle in. That was the beginning of it. She was a hard worker. I knew that in the first 2 days before I'd formed any other opinion of her. The kitchen was cleaner by the end of the first full day than it had been in years, and not in a way that announced itself or rearranged things or made me feel like a guest in my own house. It was just cleaner in the same places, only better. The second morning I came in from the morning feeding, and there was bread cooling on the board, real bread, with a good crust, and coffee on the stove, and eggs in the skillet with a little dried herb from a packet she'd brought in the carpet bag. The smell hit me in the doorway, and I stood there for a full second before I remembered where I was going. I sat down and ate and didn't say much, and she sat across from me with her own coffee and Lucy ate beside her, and the morning light came in the east window, the kitchen window, not the east-facing bedroom window, but enough light, and I thought, this is what it was for, all of it. The building and the stocking and the keeping. This is what it was for. I didn't say that. It would have been too much for breakfast on the second day. Lucy was a different matter. That child didn't sit still for 20 consecutive minutes between waking and sleeping, and everything in the world was interesting to her, and she had opinions on all of it that she shared fully and without much prompting. By the third morning she was following me to the barn, which I allowed, asking about the horses with a focused curiosity that reminded me of the way her mother asked questions, not scattered, not just talking, but actually wanting to know. I answered her when she asked. I kept an eye on her around the livestock without making a performance of it. After about a week I noticed she'd stopped asking whether it was all right before she went to pet the bay mare. Margaret watched me with her daughter. I knew it. That was her right and I didn't begrudge it. You don't know a man's character from one meal and a wagon ride. You watch him with your child because that's where it shows. The first Friday I paid her, I'd settled on $4 a week, which was a fair wage for the work she was doing and maybe a shade more. She took the bills, folded them carefully, and put them in her dress pocket without comment. No thanks that were more than the occasion called for, no deflecting, no performance. She put the money away the way a person does who's keeping their own accounts and knows where that money goes. Good. That was the right way to be about it. We settled into a pattern. I was up before dawn and out to the barn. She had coffee ready when I came in at 7:30. We ate. I went out again. She kept the house. Midday I came in for the main meal. Evenings I came in for the last time and we ate again, and the evenings were quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet. The kind of quiet between two people who are both used to being quiet and don't need to fill it. She asked about 3 weeks in whether she could start a kitchen garden in the spring. There was a south-facing patch between the house and the well house that got good light. I said yes. She said she'd need some seeds and some fencing to keep the rabbits out. I said we'd get what she needed. She said thank you and went back to her mending, and that was the whole negotiation. The trouble with the territory started before November was out. I went to the Mercantile in Sentinel for salt and lamp oil on a Tuesday afternoon toward the end of the month. A quick trip, nothing to it, and Doris Hennessy, who ran the place with her husband Walt and who had been keeping track of the county's business for 30 years with a thoroughness that would have been impressive if it had been pointed somewhere useful, said to me in a tone designed to sound like concern, "I heard you took in that Sloane woman and her girl." I said I hired a housekeeper, that's right. Cold people are talking. I said people can talk. She's living in your house. She works in my house and lives there, same as any hired hand who sleeps in the bunkhouse. There's a difference and you know it. I looked at Doris for a moment. I said the difference is she's a woman, Yes, I know that. Are you going to sell me my goods? She sold me my goods. The way she did it told me clearly enough what the winter was going to look like in town. It built slowly, the way these things build in small places, where nothing moves fast and nothing dies fast either. By December, I was hearing it clearly enough not to my face, because most people in that county didn't have the directness to say to a man's face what they'd say 2 feet to his left. They said it near me, around me, aimed at the air while I happened to be in it. The widow Sloane, living out on the Cimarron with Cole Alderman. A woman in her situation, all alone with a man who's not her husband, out there where nobody can see. Well, what do you suppose? What they meant under all of it was a woman like her, a woman who'd come from somewhere else with nothing, whose husband's debts had eaten her whole, who had no family in the county, no connections, nobody to vouch for her character or stand behind her name. The territory had a long memory for that kind of woman, and not a kind one. The same territory that would have left her sitting on those Ritter building steps until she spent her $11, and then what? Nobody seemed to be asking. I heard it and I didn't say anything. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I was thinking about something else. Margaret knew, of course she knew. She went into Sentinel every week or 10 days for small things, thread, a tin of this, a sack of that, and she came back quieter each time, not dramatically quieter, not in a way she'd have said anything about if I'd asked, but in the particular way that the air around a person is quieter when they've been carrying something they didn't have when they left. Lucy picked it up the way children pick up things the adults around them can't see, and would sit in Margaret's lap in the evenings and not ask why. One evening in December, I remember it clearly, the 15th or thereabouts, because I'd spent the afternoon fixing a gate hinge in the kind of cold that makes the metal bite your skin when you touch it barehanded, and I'd come in still thawing out. I found Margaret at the kitchen table with her account book open in front of her. She kept an account book. She'd bought it in November, a small one, brown cover, and she wrote in it in a careful hand, small letters, everything she spent and everything she earned and where the balance stood. I'd noticed it early on and I respected it considerably. I poured myself coffee, poured her a cup to replace the one that had gone cold, and sat down across from her. She didn't close the book. She looked at it for a moment, then she said, "I'm thinking I should go." I said, "Go where?" She said, "Somewhere else. Town, maybe. I've been looking at the numbers. There might be enough by February for Lucy and me too." I said, "Why?" She looked up. "Because I'm causing you trouble by being here, the kind of trouble that doesn't go away." I said, "My trouble is mine to manage." She said, "Cole." First time she'd said my name without the mister. "I know what they're saying in town, about me, about this arrangement, and the longer I'm here the worse it gets, and—" I said, "Margaret, people in that county have been talking about me since 1869. They said I was a fool to buy this land, too far out, no market. They said the spring would dry up by the third summer. They said I couldn't winter cattle on the Cimarron, and they were half right, but not all the way right. I'm still here, and I'm not thinking about what they said." She said, "This is different." I said, "How?" She was quiet for a moment. Lucy was asleep. I could hear her breathing through the door, the particular soft sound of a child sleeping hard. The fire cracked, wind moving in the cottonwoods down toward the river. Then Margaret said, very carefully, because it might be true, "What they're saying." I said, "What might be true?" She said that I've come to care about being here, more than what the arrangement calls for. She looked at the account book. More than I should have, maybe. The fire settled, the wind off the river. I said, "Margaret." She looked at me. I said, "I built that third room 20 years ago. Built it when I was 31 years old and I thought I was going to be married. Left it empty when I wasn't. Kept it empty for 20 years, bed made, window clean, chest polished." I turned my coffee cup on the table. I wasn't good at this kind of talking. Hadn't had much practice at it. "It's not empty now." She said quietly, "What are you saying?" I said, "I'm saying I'd like you to stay, not as a housekeeper, as my wife if you'd have me." I kept my eyes on her. I know what the town thinks. I don't give a damn what the town thinks. I know what I think. I've watched you work since October. I've watched you with Lucy. I've watched you when you don't know you're being watched, and I know what I think about you, and I'd like to say it plain if you'll let me. She sat with that. The way she sat with things, not rushing to fill the space, not performing consideration, actually thinking. She said, "You're asking me." I said, "Yes." She said, not to quiet the talk. "No," I said. "I'm asking because I want to, because you're who I want beside me on this place." She was quiet for another moment. Then she put her hand on the table between us, palm up, open, not reaching, offering. I put my hand over hers. We sat like that a while. I didn't feel the need to say anything more, and I don't think she did either. We married in January at the courthouse in Sentinel, in front of Judge Merritt, who was a fair-minded man, economical with words, and who'd been marrying and burying the people of this county for 15 years without giving anyone cause for complaint. He did the whole thing in about 4 minutes, which was about right. There wasn't much that needed saying. The point of it was in the doing. Margaret wore her dark blue dress with the white buttons at the collar, the good one. I'd put on my good suit, which I hadn't worn in 8 years and which still fit because I hadn't changed shape much in 8 years, just gotten a little more worn at the edges, same as everything else. Lucy wore a new ribbon in her hair. I'd gone into the mercantile 2 days before specifically to buy it, which required enduring Doris Hennessy's face, a price I was willing to pay. The ribbon was yellow. Lucy had opinions about ribbons, and yellow was her current position. Judge Merritt asked the questions, and we answered them, and he said the words, and that was that. We were married. Doris Hennessy saw us coming out of the courthouse. Her face did something I didn't spend any time reading. I held the door for Margaret and lifted Lucy up to the wagon seat, and we drove home. The drive home was clear and cold. One of those January days on the southern plains that has no mercy to it but a hard beauty. Everything sharp. The sky too blue to look at straight. The frozen road ringing under the wheels. The cottonwoods black and bare against all that blue. Margaret sat close beside me because it was cold, and after a while she put her hand through my arm and left it there. And Lucy sat on her other side, eating a piece of dried fruit she'd produced from somewhere in her coat pocket, entirely occupied by it. I thought, this is mine, this right here. This is what the 22 years was for. Not that it all changed at once. Nothing does on a working place. The work was still the work. The morning feeding, the stove, the checking of the fence line, the day's particular set of needs that made itself known as the day went on. But the frame of it changed. And I didn't understand entirely how much had been missing from the frame until it was there. Small things. The sound of a woman's voice in the house when I came in from the barn in the morning, not speaking to me necessarily, sometimes speaking to Lucy, sometimes just the sound of someone moving around the house doing what needed doing. Lucy's boots by the door, small and scuffed, frequently on the wrong feet because she put them on herself, and had not yet developed strong feelings about which was which. The smell of what Margaret had made for breakfast, proper food, not just what kept a man going but actual food, made with thought. Light in the windows when I came in at dark, just light, from the inside. I'd kept this house right for 22 years. The windows were clean and the floors were swept, and there was always enough wood laid in. But there's a difference between a house that's kept right and a house that's lived in, and I had not known that difference from the inside until I was on the other side of it. By February, I had started to understand it. Margaret learned the place the way a person learns land they intend to keep, not just the surface of it but the underneath, the way it worked. Which cow was milked first and why the old roan got anxious if she waited and then kicked, which was just her nature, and you worked with nature. The sound the well rope made when the bucket was full versus when it wasn't, they sound different, just slightly, if you know to listen. The way the river looked when the temperature was going to drop another 10 degrees by morning, the particular color the water went. She asked good questions, the ones that needed answering. She didn't ask the ones that would answer themselves if she paid attention. Lucy, meanwhile, was Lucy, which was its own full-time occupation. She named 3 of the horses. The bay mare became Rosie, the gray gelding became Captain, and the mule, who was named Bill because I had named him Bill and he knew his name and I wasn't changing it. Lucy renamed Captain Bill and split the difference by calling the gray gelding something else. I couldn't always remember what because it changed. She had opinions about the chickens. She had, in fact, named most of the chickens, and she'd report on the chickens at supper the way some men report on cattle prices. She called me Mr. Alderman until March. Then one afternoon I was fixing the wheel on a small wagon I'd made for her out of scrap oak and a couple of old spokes, nothing fancy, just something she could pull her things around in, and she watched me work, and when I set it upright and showed her it was right, she took the handle and said, "Thank you, Papa Cole." Then she walked the wagon off toward the barn like she hadn't said anything at all. I stood there with my tools in my hands. Then I went and found something that needed doing. Vickers came into it in April. Harlan Vickers owned the Rafter T, which ran cattle on the grass north and east of my place. He was a man who'd come into the territory with money behind him, not the kind of money you earn working, but the kind that was already there when you showed up, and he'd used it to buy land and buy more land and buy more, until he had more land than he could run right and not quite enough that he was satisfied. Men like Vickers are never satisfied. They count what they have, and what they have always tells them what they don't have yet. What Vickers didn't have was the Cimarron bottom land, my 160 acres, the spring, the river rights. He'd made me offers twice, in '81 and again in '83. Reasonable offers on their face, fair market price, no pressure. I'd said no both times because the land wasn't for sale at any price, and he knew that when he asked. And the reason he kept asking anyway was that men like Vickers believe everything, eventually, has a price, if you find the right place to apply the pressure. He thought he'd found it in April. He rode out himself, didn't send a man, came himself on a good black horse, which told me he'd decided to make this serious. I was out in the south pasture checking on a calf that had been slow to get up that morning when I saw the horse from a distance, saw it go to the house. I started walking. I came around the corner of the house to find Margaret on the porch and Vickers on his horse below her, and even from 20 yards I could read his posture, the particular posture of a man who thinks he's dealing with someone who doesn't have many options and knows it. He was talking in a measured, sympathetic way, the kind of measured sympathy that's designed to make the person it's aimed at feel like they're being done a favor. What he was saying, when I was close enough to hear, was something about Margaret's situation, a woman in her position, the land having certain complications. A man with his resources could make it easier, a fair arrangement, something that would be good for her and the girl. I said, "Vickers." He stopped and looked at me. I said, "You're talking to my wife." He said, "Cole, the way men like him say your name when they're recalibrating. I'm just." I said, "You're done. Get off my land." He sat his horse and looked at me for a moment, deciding something. Then he said, "You're going to make this hard." I said, "No, I'm going to tell you to leave. You can leave easy or you can leave some other way. That's the only decision in front of you right now." He looked at Margaret, he looked at me. He turned his horse and rode. Margaret watched him go. Then she said, "How long has he been after the land?" I said, "Since '81. She said, "He'll be back." I said, "I'd expect so." She said, "What do you need me to do?" I looked at her. She wasn't asking out of fear or politeness. She was standing on her porch on her land, asking what the work was. I said, "Know where the rifle is." She said, "I know where the rifle is." "Know how to use it." She said, "Frank Sloan wasn't good for much. He taught me to shoot." This time I did almost smile. Vickers came back in June, which was about when I expected him. He didn't come himself this time. He sent 2 of his hands, the Prout cousins, Len and Darnell, not bright but capable of following instructions and carrying themselves like they meant business. They came in from the south, across the river, which meant they were coming from the back side of the property and they knew they were trespassing, which meant this wasn't an accident. I was in the barn when Margaret appeared in the doorway on the bay mare, the one she'd taken to riding in the evenings to see the place. She pulled up and said, "Two of Vickers's men are at the house. They were looking in the windows." I said, "Lucy." "With me." I hadn't seen her. Lucy was behind Margaret, tucked against her back. I said, "Go to the Garrity place. Tell Amos what's happening. He'll know what to do." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Go to the house and talk to these men." She looked at me for a moment. There was something in her face I hadn't quite seen before, not fear for herself. Fear for me, the kind that comes from somewhere real. She said, "Cole." I said, "Go, Margaret." She put her hand on the side of my face. Quick, firm, her palm flat against my jaw for just a second. Then she turned the horse and rode. I picked up the rifle that hung inside the barn door and went to the house. Len and Darnell Prout were around back when I came through the house and out the back door. They had that look men get when they've been sent to do something they've decided to make a show of, the loose, easy posture of men who expect to have the upper hand. Len had his hand on my back fence post like he owned it. I said, "Help you boys with something." Len said, "Mr. Vickers wants to talk to you, Mr. Alderman." I said, "Mr. Vickers knows where I live. He can come talk to me himself." He thought maybe you needed some persuading first. I looked at both of them. I said, "I'm going to tell you something and I want you to hear it right. I have been on this piece of ground for 22 years. I have dug my well and built my house and run my fence line and planted my orchard and buried my dead on this piece of ground, and I intend to be buried on it myself someday. I am 53 years old and I am done being persuaded of anything by anyone, and most especially I am done being persuaded on my own land. Now you boys are going to get on your horses and ride back to Vickers and tell him the answer is the same as it always was. You understand me?" Darnell started to move his hand toward his belt, not fast, just enough. I looked at him. I said, "Son, don't." Something passed through him. He was maybe 22, 23. He thought about it, and then he didn't do it. They rode out. I stood in the yard and watched them go. I was still in the yard when I heard the Garrity wagon coming fast down the road from the north, Amos and his two oldest boys, who were grown men and solid. And behind the wagon, on the bay mare, Margaret, riding back even before she knew it was settled. I thought about that she'd told Amos and then turned around and come back, because that was who she was. Vickers filed a legal claim in July, challenging one corner of my survey. Said the original section marker had been misplaced at the time of the original land grant, which if true would have shifted my north boundary about 40 yards, which didn't sound like much, but in terms of my spring access meant a great deal. The claim was a nuisance claim, designed to cost me time and money and to make me feel the weight of fighting, which was what it was really for. I hired a surveyor out of Dodge City. Cost me $70 and 2 trips to the courthouse. The surveyor found every original marker exactly where the original survey said they were. The claim was dismissed in September. I don't tell that part of it to make myself sound tough or put upon. I tell it because of what Margaret did through those 3 months, which was keep the house, keep the accounts, keep the garden, ride into Sentinel every week and do it with her back straight regardless of what Doris Hennessy's face was doing, and come out to the barn in the evening sometimes when I was working late by lamplight, and sit on the hay bale by the door and not say anything. Not try to fix it or talk about it or make it something to manage together out loud. Just be there. A person on the hay bale in the lamplight. I have thought about that since, trying to understand what it was. I think it was this. She knew the difference between a problem that needed talking and a problem that needed a man to work it through quietly in his own head, and she knew which this was, and she didn't make me explain it to her or ask her to leave me alone with it. She was just there. That's a thing you can't teach a person and you can't ask for. Either they know it or they don't. She knew it. The claim was dismissed on a Thursday, and I came home that day and we had supper and I told her it was done. She said good. We ate. Lucy told us at some length about something that had happened with the chickens. The evening went on. That night after Lucy was asleep, Margaret poured 2 small glasses of the dried cherry wine she made in August and kept for the evenings, and she handed me one. We sat at the kitchen table. The lamp was low. The fire was down to coals. She said, "You know what I thought, that first day you drove me out here?" I said, "What?" She said, "I thought you were either a good man or I was too tired to know the difference, and I was going to have to find out." I said, "Which was it?" She looked at me across the lamp. She said, "You know which it was." I said, "I'd like to hear it." She said, "Good man." Quiet, matter of fact, the way she said things that she meant completely, no performance in it. I turned my glass. I looked at the coals. I said, I wasn't sure for a long time that it mattered what kind of man you were if nobody was there to see it. She said, "It matters." I said, "I know that now." She said, "It always mattered. You always knew it. That's why you pulled that fence post 3 times. I looked at her. I hadn't told her about that. "How do you know about that?" She said, "Because you're the kind of man who would. I knew that inside of a week." She held my eyes. "I saw you, Cole. I saw what you were before you said a word about it. I've been seeing it since October." The fire settled, the wind in the cottonwoods. I put my hand on hers on the table, her small hand under my rough one, and I held it. Fall came around again, the second fall with Margaret and Lucy on the place, and it came in the way I like it, cool and clear, the light going golden earlier than summer and lasting longer in a different way. The orchard came in strong. Apple, pear, both plum trees, heavier than the year before. We picked for 3 days, the 3 of us, Lucy proving nimble and useful in the higher branches and taking considerable pride in this. Margaret put up preserves the way she did everything, organized, thorough, no wasted motion. Apple butter, plum jam, pear preserves in wax-sealed crocks, dried apple rings on the kitchen string. Apple cider vinegar started in 2 big crocks in the cellar. She kept a list of every crock, every jar, where it was on the shelf, what went in it and when. I told her she didn't have to keep such careful track of jam. She said the habit was the point. I understood that. The cellar was full by the end of October. Winter wheat was in. The north fence line was solid. I'd pulled and reset 6 posts that had gone soft at the base over the summer, done it right, tamped them until they stood without shifting. I'd rebuilt the chicken coop roof where the weight of last winter's snow had bowed it. The hay loft was stacked to the top board. The woodpile was the biggest it had been in 15 years. I stood in the yard one evening in early November, the last light going pink on the western bluffs, and I looked at everything. The house, the barn, the orchard with the leaves gone now, but the structure of it right and ready. The fences running straight. The stack of wood. The windows of the house lit up yellow from the inside where Margaret was finishing the supper. Everything ready. Ready for whatever the winter brought, ready for whatever came next. It's a feeling you don't get to have often. Most of the time a place has something that needs doing, something that's a little wrong, a fence that needs that one post pulled and reset. This was one of the evenings where it was just right. Just right. Margaret came to the door and said supper was on. I want to tell you about a Sunday that November, and I want to tell it right because it's the kind of thing that doesn't have the right kind of name. It was Sunday, so the big work was set aside. I kept Sunday that way, always had, in the way my mother had taught me, even though my mother had been gone 20 years and my relationship with the Lord had been through some rough country in between. But the habit held. Sunday the necessary work got done and the rest could wait. We'd had supper. A chicken Margaret had stewed slow with dried sage and some root vegetables from the cellar. And the house smelled like that for the whole evening, and Lucy had fallen asleep at the table because she was 6 and she still did that sometimes, just went out like a lamp. I'd carried her to bed. She was heavier than she used to be, solid in my arms the way a growing child gets, and she didn't wake up, just settled against me and kept sleeping. I laid her down and pulled the quilt up. When I came back to the kitchen, Margaret was at the table with the lamp low and her mending in her hands and her small glass of the cherry wine. I poured myself a short measure of whiskey and sat across from her. We didn't talk for a good while. The fire was going, banking itself down to a long, slow heat the way a good fire does when it's right. The wind off the river, the lamp, the color of the room. After a while she set down her mending and looked at me. She said, "You never told me why you stayed. When the years got long, most men would have sold and gone somewhere there were more people." I said, "I built something worth keeping." She said, "That's not really an answer." I thought about it. I said, "I suppose I believed it was going to be for something. All of it. The fence and the wheat and the orchard and the keeping it right. I believed it was going to amount to something someday, even when I didn't know what." She said, "Did you ever doubt it?" I said, "Some winters." She said, "But you stayed." I said, "I stayed." She looked at me across the lamp. She said quietly, the way she said things she meant all the way, "I'm glad you did." I said, "So am I." She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. Not a gentle touch, firm, the way you hold something you mean to hold. We sat like that until the fire went to coals. Outside, the wind moved the cottonwoods along the river. That sound they make in November when the leaves are gone and it's just the branches. A dry rattling that I had heard for 22 years alone and never thought much about. And that night I sat and listened to it with my wife's hand over mine and thought about how long a man can hear a sound without ever really hearing it. The second winter was hard, but we were ready for it. Hard cold in February, the kind that comes to the southern plains maybe once a decade, temperature dropping 30 degrees between noon and dark and the northwest wind coming like a judgment. I spent most of the worst of it in the barn, keeping the animals right, hauling water that kept trying to freeze in the bucket, carrying extra hay, checking the horses for signs of trouble. The worst 2 nights I didn't come in until almost midnight. Margaret had hot water ready both nights when I came in. She kept the stove going and the water hot without being asked. And she had food in the warming oven, and she didn't ask me how it had gone because she could see how it had gone. And she didn't tell me I should have come in earlier because she knew I'd come in when I could come in and not before. What she did, both nights, was look at my hands when I came in. The second night, the worst of the two, my knuckles were cracked and bleeding from the cold. The skin split at the joints the way it does when you're working in that temperature without gloves, which you sometimes have to do when the gloves are in the way of what your hands need to do. She got the salve she kept for cuts and wounds, a good one. She'd made it herself in the summer from rendered fat and beeswax, and some herb I couldn't name, but that worked. And she stood at the table and put it on my knuckles, both hands, working it into the splits with her thumbs, careful where it hurt and steady where it didn't. She didn't say anything about it. She just did it. Then she handed me my supper and sat down. I ate the fire, the wind, outside 20 below and still dropping. I thought about things. I thought about the post in the north fence, October 2 years ago, the way I'd pulled it 3 times until it stood right with nobody watching. I thought about the 22 years of doing it right for its own sake, the standard that didn't slip, the accounting you keep with yourself that doesn't have any words. I thought about the way a man can go on like that for 20 years and be right about the work, and not understand what the work was for until a woman stands at the kitchen table in February and puts salve on his cracked knuckles like it's the most ordinary thing, like it's just what you do, like he's worth doing that for. He is worth it. He was always worth it. But you don't quite know that until someone shows it to you, not with words, but with their hands at your hands in the lamplight in February when nobody's watching, and it doesn't need to be anything other than what it is. Spring came in slowly the way it does on the Cimarron, then all at once the way it always does, the river running high with snowmelt, the grass coming fast after the wet winter, the orchard budding out earlier than usual, the whole place coming back from what the cold had done to it and coming back well. Margaret's kitchen garden went in by the end of March. The south-facing patch between the house and the well house, the fence she'd asked about in the fall, the seeds she'd saved from last year's garden added to what she'd bought from the mercantile. The rows went in straight, and she kept a record of what went where and when. Lucy turned 6 in April. We gave her a cake Margaret made it right, molasses and dried fruit, better than what you got in the hotel dining room, and I gave her a pony. A brown and white pinto mare, bought at the sale barn in March, maybe 12 years old, steady and gentle and patient in a way that suggested she'd been around children before and had made her peace with it. She was old enough not to spook, young enough for years of use. Lucy named her Biscuit inside of about 30 seconds of being introduced, a name that was opaque to me, but apparently made perfect sense to Lucy. Lucy cried when she first saw the pony. The kind of crying that doesn't know what to do with what it feels, the eyes go, and the face, and then she just stood there with her hands at her sides letting it happen. And then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and picked up the lead rope and led Biscuit toward the barn, talking to her steadily the whole way, explaining things. Margaret stood beside me watching. She said, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "I know." She put her arm through mine. We stood there in the yard watching the girl and the pony make their slow way to the barn, and the spring light was the way spring light is on that river bottom. Particular, the kind that makes everything look like it's just been set down there and hasn't gotten dusty yet. The cottonwoods leafing out pale green, the orchard in blossom, the grass coming in thick along the bank. I looked at it, all of it. The house and the barn and the fence line and the orchard and the field coming in, and the woman beside me with her arm through mine and the girl with her pony. Margaret leaned her head against my shoulder. She said quietly, "I'm glad I stayed." I said, "So am I." And that was all of it. That was the whole of it. 22 years of doing it right when nobody was watching, and the fence standing and the wheat in and the orchard bearing and the house warm and a good woman beside me who came with nothing and gave everything and saw what I was before I said a word about it. The territory had thrown her away. I married her. And what we made on that piece of ground on the Cimarron was ours, and it was worth everything it had cost to get there. The wind came easy off the river. I let it come.